Welcome to training focused on responding to aviation accidents, the role of stations. This training has been developed for the exclusive use of Empathia's aviation clients, their station employees, subcontractors, and ground handlers. Reproduction or use of this material by other parties is strictly prohibited. It's 10 p.m. You are on duty with one other person. The last flight of the day is due in shortly. You look to the runway where Flight 999 is scheduled to land and witness something you never want to see. The aircraft has experienced an uncontrolled landing, has skidded off the runway and caught fire. What do you do? This training will help answer that question. We're going to take a look at several objectives. First being some explanation as to why we're talking about this particular topic. We're going to talk about the definition of family assistance, the roles based on your station's position within the flight path of the affected aircraft. We will discuss some crisis communication, helpful and unhelpful statements, and then finally we'll talk about the importance of self-care. In 1996, a piece of legislation was passed here in the U.S. and primarily was developed in response to a series of aviation accidents in which family members had some very strong criticism of the airlines in terms of how they responded in the aftermath. And so, long story short, between the 1996 Aviation Disaster Family Assistance Act, the Foreign Carrier Act, which essentially required the same of any foreign carrier coming in and out of the United States, we now have a federal law that requires airlines to not only submit a plan and describe how they will be addressing the needs of families, passengers and families in the aftermath of an accident, but also created a whole separate division within the National Transportation Safety Board. So today there are both an investigative arm and an arm that is solely focused on family assistance and making sure that airlines meet the several mandates that are required of them. I'm not going to go through all of the 32 victim support tasks, but suffice it to say that many of them have to do with the provision of information. And if you look at the first few here, information as it becomes known, families from those previous accidents felt that airlines were withholding information, being dishonest about what it is they did and did not know. I'm absolutely convinced that that was really probably not the reason, but rather without a plan, it's very difficult to anticipate where and how the information is going to flow, and that was probably the greatest challenge, and as a result families felt that they didn't get what they were looking for. So if you look at the fourth bullet, this is precisely where the station role comes into play. We are to secure facilities for families at both the departure and destination stations as well as connecting stations. And so this is what we'll talk about in depth today. I want to also briefly introduce Empathia. This is my company. My name is Andrea, and we are your emergency response partner. We have quite a bit of experience in responding to critical incidents and mass casualty events, including several aviation accidents. We provide kind of a continuum for most of our client carriers, and we have an extensive network of responders that's going to be very helpful in the event that an accident occurs at your station. We have about 10,000 throughout the United States, I should say North America. And so we hope to be able to deploy some of our responders to the stations at the time of an accident to support you in your tasks. And just a word about kind of the experience and the approach that we take. If we remember one thing, and if that one thing has been shown to be true over and over again, it's that irrespective of whether we're talking about terrorism, a natural disaster, or even an aviation accident, what people want and need and actually will expect and demand is information. So much of our preparedness is anticipating that need and addressing that need at the time of an accident. So let's talk about family assistance specifically. That's the name of the legislation. And interestingly, the legislation does not define what is meant by family. What is clear is that the legislation's intent was to encourage airlines to allow families to define what is their family. In other words, adopting a very inclusive definition. So it's very unlike the norm today that a family is a husband, wife, and 1.8 children. That's not the way our society looks anymore. And so looking at who constitutes a family member, we like to use something similar to what you see here. It could be a bond created by biology, legal proceedings, or a relationship of some emotional significance. So what is not considered family, at least in the early hours, would be such relationships as boss, coworker, neighbor, friend. That may change into the response if no one else has become associated with that passenger, but at least early on, this is our kind of inclusive, wide definition of family. And that's important because only family, or quote, family, should be provided information about what has happened to that passenger. And that'll become clear as we go along. So what is family assistance? Well, if you look at it as kind of three basic things. We want to create some kind of environment in which people feel safe and secure, and that they can come to trust you to follow through on your promises. We also clearly become a source of hopefully credible and accurate information. Many times in those early hours, you, in talking with families that may come to your airport, are going to be actually refuting what the media has been saying. But typically the media has gotten it wrong, and so your information will have come directly from official sources. And then finally, meeting basic needs includes things like making sure families have access to the restroom, food, and shelter and beverage. So where does family assistance take place? Well, empathia, I mentioned a few moments ago, at the time of an accident represents you, the carrier, among those passenger families, and a toll-free number is published in the media that invites people who may believe that they know someone on board the affected aircraft to call, and that call center is actually operated by Empathia. So we're processing those calls on your behalf. The next place, and the place we're going to talk about most today, is the Airport Friends and Family Reception Center. This is this area that should be established at both the departure, destination, and any connecting stations. And it's meant to be a special area in which information and assistance and support can be provided to those family members who are waiting to learn as to what has happened to their loved one. Later on in the process, there's something called a Family Assistance Center established, and the Family Assistance Center, or FAC, is typically a large hotel in or near the accident city. The airline is required to arrange and pay for transportation for family members to travel there if they choose to do so, to pay for their food and lodging, etc. And usually that on-site response lasts 4 to 7 days or so. Obviously, we may have passengers in the hospital, so family assistance is being provided there, as well as, and not common, but as requested, we can also provide that in victim families' homes in their own communities. So when is family assistance provided? Well, for the station purpose, it's very short term, and if you look at how this kind of unfolds, most times in the airports these rooms are available and have been pre-identified, but they're not meant to be long-term in nature. The real intent is to ultimately get family members to that family assistance center, that large hotel. So think of your role as fairly intense but short-term in nature. And then finally, why are we even talking about this? Well, as I said, this is legislatively required. It certainly is the right thing to do, and it has been shown to mitigate liability. Not to say that families of passengers who are injured or killed as a result of an accident aren't going to sue, because they probably are, but it has been shown to reduce the level of anger and dissatisfaction with the carrier, which does translate ultimately into lesser liabilities. So it's very important to understand that families' perceptions of how the airline is performing is going to affect the airline's reputation at the time of an accident. So let's take a look at specific roles at the affected airports. Let's look at a kind of a 6-hour window. We know that families are going to view the local airport as a source of information. In other words, if I have just dropped somebody off at the airport to catch a flight and the plane experiences the accident shortly after takeoff, I'm going to turn around and come back into the airport to get information. And similarly, if I'm waiting to pick somebody up in the destination station, I'm going to ultimately come inside the building and start asking questions as to where my loved one is, because they were supposed to land several minutes ago. So the stations truly are a critical source of information, not just for family purpose, but within the whole response effort. In other words, the station holds some very key information that needs to be shared. And for example, the station at which the accident has occurred or the nearest to the accident, that station holds the information that concerns what has physically happened to each and every passenger and crew member. So the search and recovery efforts take place specifically there, and your station would specifically have that information. We want to know, as the response unfolds, how many family members are present at various airports. And certainly we want to keep a bead on some of their requests and their needs. And finally, one of the important data elements is to combine where and how notifications are taking place. In other words, notification is simply informing a family member of what we know at a certain point in time. And in looking at that kind of in an aggregate sense, that really does kind of paint a picture as to how well, how organized, how responsive the airline has been in connecting with those passenger families. So families' perceptions of how well the airline is responding is actually initially going to be formed at the stations and based on your actions. And remember, first impressions are very important. So let's take a look at the station tasks, and they will vary depending on your station's position within the flight path. So the first thing that you'll want to do is identify, are we the departure station, the destination station? Might you be a connecting station for a group or even a single passenger? And then you also could in fact be the accident station. So your station emergency response plan has a series of checklists that get at some of these specifics. And so at all of the stations, we want to prepare the ticket counter because those are the folks that will be first encountering family members coming to the airport seeking information. They may be needing to issue gate passes if the family reception room is in a sterile part of the airport. So we know that the ticket counter needs to be prepared. We also know that those friends and family reception centers need some setup. We'll talk about that in a moment. So that's a given, especially if you are a departure or destination station. And then finally, the departure station has one unique checklist, which has to do with reconciling the manifest or looking at boarding documents, comparing that with a preliminary passenger list, and thereby confirming who in fact boarded the flight. The accident station has another unique checklist and role that has to do with placing an airline employee or representative in the airport's emergency operations center. And you become the voice and face of the airline among all of the local authorities, airport authority, in terms of exchanging information about passengers and crew and the aircraft itself. I think it's fairly safe to say that probably several of these have occurred to you already. We certainly recognize that most stations are not overstaffed. We also know from experience that it may not seem like it at the moment, but if an accident were to occur as an employee or even as a ground handler working for a carrier, an accident is going to personally affect you in some way, shape, or form. You'll be having to deal with families who are highly anxious and worried. The environment itself is going to feel fairly chaotic, and despite the best plan in the world, nothing ever goes completely the way you want it to or it's supposed to. And then to add to the challenge, not only are you responding to the accident, but most times you're also expected to continue normal operations. And then finally, the other aspect and challenge that will really be a challenge is the fact that the media will very quickly be probably at your ticket counter. They're going to be trying to interview you as an employee. They're going to try to interview passengers as to, are you really going to get on an aircraft on this airline? They just had an accident. And they also will be very tenacious and creative in trying to get inside those family reception areas, which are meant to be private and secure. I also want to give you some information on some other things important to know. The passenger manifest should be kept as confidential as possible, which is not to say that some people in performing their roles do need a copy of it. But for example, the ticket counter, the TSA, the airport authority, and even the command center at the airport authority level, they don't need a copy of the passenger manifest. They might be concerned about how many people were on board, what was the cargo on board, but they do not need the passenger names. And so we're going to be very firm about that. And one of the things that we want to impart to you is that if you are pressured and ask for a passenger manifest, do not hand that over. Instead, communicate that to your carrier's headquarter command center, and they will take care of that. The other thing to remember is that we know that other airlines at your airport are going to offer their help, which is really great. On a day-to-day basis, you might be fierce competitors, but at the time of an accident, this becomes an industry accident, and everybody really does step up. So think about that in advance. How will you use those other helpers as you respond to the accident within your station. They can certainly be helpful with logistical tasks. They should not perform some of these notification tasks that we're going to talk about in a couple minutes. And similarly, the Red Cross local chapter is going to probably show up. They are a resource, and they too can help with logistical tasks. They can help within the family reception area in terms of helping the family members perhaps fill out forms, procure the food and beverage. But remember, the airline is always in charge. That's based on that legislation. And so if, in fact, there's any kind of discussion around who's responsible for what, the airline is absolutely responsible for addressing those family needs and providing the information to families as it becomes available. So we know that the families are going to arrive at the departure and destination city. Unfortunately, unlike the old days, we used to be able to go to the gate. Many of you probably don't remember that, but used to just walk up to the gate and find people who were waiting for a particular flight to come in. Well, today we have to get a little bit creative and investigate all the places that family members may be. Now, certainly if I'm sitting in the cell phone lot and I don't get that phone call that I've been waiting, and now several minutes have gone by, I may very well park the car and come into the airport. So this would be something to think about as you're trying to identify who in the airport might be a family member. And generally, there's an overhead announcement to that effect that, you know, individuals waiting for the arrival of flight ABC are asked to report to the XYZ airline ticket counter, because the whole goal is to escort those families to a private, secure area, which we call the Friends and Family Reception Center, or FFRC. So let's talk about what that looks like. Well, first of all, it's not specific to your airline. In other words, every airport should have this pre-identified and hopefully communicated to all the carriers that operate there. If you don't know where your Friends and Family Reception Center is, find out, because you'll want to have knowledge of that, and you'll want to also be able to determine what kind of facility it is. Does it have access to those restrooms that we talked about? You know, how many people will it seat comfortably? And that's going to vary tremendously from airport to airport. The other thing is, it might be inside a sterile area, and in that case, both the arriving family members and the empathia responders are going to need gate passes and go through the TSA secure flight check. That's an additional challenge. The area itself is really designed to provide that private, secure place where you as the airline can be providing ongoing information. There will be curiosity seekers in the airport. There will certainly be media intrusion, and we want to try to protect and shield family members that are out of their minds with worry about their loved ones, and we want to keep away all those extra elements that will only complicate things. You should definitely ask for security at the entrance to this family reception center, as well as, by the way, at the ticket counter. And then we talked about the fact that basic needs generally should be addressed in this area. The Red Cross often can be helpful in, as I said, procuring the food and beverage and those other kinds of things. So looking at staffing, and I realize when I say this that in some cases your station personnel might be 1 or 2 people on duty. The ideal is that 3 or 4 people should be available to staff the Friends and Family Reception Center. And here are the positions within that group. 1 person should be positioned outside the doorway. He or she should have a copy of the preliminary passenger list. And so when the person steps up to a table or an area and says, my name is Jane Smith, and I believe my husband, Donald Smith, is on board the flight that's had the accident. So that person is going to look at the list and determine yes or no that that woman's husband's name does or does not appear on the passenger list. And if it does, she will be allowed to enter the secure area. If it doesn't, the lady can be told that the name does not appear on the list. It's most probable that her husband's on another flight. She should keep trying to reach him, but probably not a good idea to allow her entrance. Important to remember, too, that this is why the protection of the manifest is so important, because once the manifest leaks, anybody can walk up and say, I'm the wife of so-and-so, or I'm the sister or brother of so-and-so, because the information is now widely available. And then we truly have no way of knowing who's legitimate and who's not. So the person outside the doorway, and then preferably 2 or 3 people inside the room. Now this could include the Red Cross. It could include maybe a couple of folks from another airline, and it's more of an assisting role in terms of filling out forms, making sure that food and beverage are available. And then the 4th position is a critical role that should always be performed by a representative from the airline. It's also a role that we have trained our empathia responders to perform. And essentially, this is the kind of the face and the voice of the carrier among those families waiting. And there's kind of a circular process that takes place. So every 20 minutes or so, this person is going to dial into a family assistance conference bridge. It's a secure bridge. There's a toll-free number and an access code. And this is all explained within your station plan. But the purpose of that is to now be connected to your corporate command center. You'll also be connected to Empathia's command center. And together, we will be updating each other on what has happened since the last time we spoke. So, for example, you can provide the information that you have X number of families in the reception area. These are some of their issues or complaints. And then you can also hear from the command center, okay, this is now what we know about search and rescue, that we have some injuries, that we have some uninjured, and then we also have believed to have some fatalities. So all of that information is held in various places, and by coming together on the bridge, that can be effectively shared. The important thing then is after you've come to the bridge and gotten that information, you're going to return back into the friends and family reception area and introduce yourself as the person that's going to continually provide updates to everybody sitting and waiting. And even if there is no real additional news or information, it's important that you still keep to that maybe 20-minute or so or 30-minute cycle, so that families come to trust that you are going to address their terrible need for information, and that will go a long way in establishing goodwill and credibility among those families. As I say, the empathia responders represent you as a carrier at the time of a response. The Red Cross does not, the airport authority and other airlines cannot say the same. So you can use the empathia responders if you need to and want to provide this lead person in the Friends and Family Reception Center. The conference bridge, as I mentioned, is simply a toll-free number. It's really important that someone come to that bridge every 20 minutes or so and both provide and receive information as to what is happening at various locations and at various points in time. The preliminary passenger list should be provided to the staff that are going to go to the Friends and Family Reception Center. However, do not ever lay out the manifest document so people can look at it. We want to carefully cross-reference the name of the subject of the inquiry with the names that are on the list. Now, inside the private area, your station plan has some sort of form that's basically demographic information about the passenger, about the family member who is inquiring, and so completion of that form is really helpful. There is kind of a notification process that starts with the fact that our preliminary list would essentially confirm that that person, that loved one, did hold a reservation for flight ABC. Okay? That's really all it says. Then we want to explain to that family member that we are in the process of confirming who actually boarded the flight, which is a very different proposition, because people can even check in and not board, as you well know. So this is kind of a rolling process, and starting with the forms that get filled out, we need to track those notifications as they take place. So a couple of things. Your forms can be faxed, but it's fairly frequently that we have found that stations don't have a really convenient way of faxing forms. So the other way that we can obtain this and put it in our master information system is to have somebody verbally relay, not every detail, but at least names of family members associated with what passengers, and maybe a telephone number for that family member. So once the passenger list is confirmed, and typically that will happen, hopefully will happen within the first 2 hours. If there are no changes, if the preliminary list looks exactly the same as the confirmed list, a general announcement can be made that we've received the copy of the confirmed list, that everybody that was listed on the preliminary list is now been confirmed as having boarded the flight. However, we continue to wait for additional information from the authorities at the scene. You might want to acknowledge that you understand that waiting is difficult, and that's really what you need to empathize with. People that are waiting and are so fearful that something horrible has happened to their loved one. 5 minutes is going to seem like a long time, and so be cognizant of that and try to empathize with the fact that as the minutes tick by, it seems like an eternity for many of those family members. So again, this will evolve, and confirming the passenger's status, that's going to vary tremendously in terms of how long that takes. If the accident occurs on airport property, that will be determined and communicated much more quickly, as opposed to an aircraft that goes down in the water, in the middle of a forest, or other kind of remote locations. So the waiting might be much longer if it's an off-airport property accident. But it's important that you understand kind of the process and how this is going to evolve. One of the things that has been a advantageous development since 9/11 is the fact that it's now recognized that in a mass casualty event, the organization needs to be able to ultimately account for what has happened to every single person, whether that's an employer or, in this case, your airline that needs to account for every passenger and crew. Now, on a normal day, you can't just call a hospital and ask who's been admitted, and I need to have their information. However, in the aftermath of a mass casualty event, the Red Cross has been sanctioned to serve as this information conduit. And using and connecting with the Red Cross personnel, we can ultimately obtain that information at the hospitals. Now, that's something else that either your command center is working on or Empathia is working on your carrier's behalf, because that is ultimately what needs to happen. Is we need to be able to tell Mrs. Jones that her husband has been admitted to this particular hospital and then help her to get there. So it's easy to see, I think, that the most complicated accidents are those in which we have kind of a mixture of injured, uninjured, and then possibly fatalities. And because it's so critical that we get the right information about a specific loved one, that tends to be the longest in duration in terms of being able to provide those notifications. So let's take the possibilities. And this, of course, is all taking place within the Friends and Family Reception Center. So if there are uninjured passengers, you will have your airport fire chief or some other official communicating that, and you're hearing that because somebody from your company hopefully is sitting around that table, or if nothing else, the command center at your headquarters has been told that there are uninjured passengers. And so if that's the case, you want to take a look at what family members might be sitting in the family reception center that need to be reunited with those uninjured passengers. Now, I think you probably can understand why, but you would never want an uninjured passenger to come into the family center. That would be very difficult for other people to witness who are still waiting to hear what has happened to their loved one. However, if need be, the family member could be escorted wherever the uninjured passenger area might be, or maybe there's yet a third location that can be established for this reunification. If there are injured passengers, you're going to want to privately inform the family member of that. Now, if the accident has occurred locally at your station, what you'll want to do is coordinate some arrangement to transport them to the hospital. Obviously, something has happened to my loved one. I need to get to them as quickly as possible. Now, if the accident has occurred in another location entirely, a couple of things. It's possible the family member wants to jump on the next flight. It's just as likely that they want to go home and at least pack a suitcase full of, their items, come back to the airport, and then travel to the accident city. The important thing to remember is if that's the case, somebody from the crisis call center will help make those arrangements, will become a point of contact for that family member as they transition to the accident city and to be with their loved one in the hospital. Unfortunately, we also need to talk about this possibility. And what's important to say about this is that we would never use the word died or death. Death is a legal and medical term, and obviously we are not professionals that would be able to pronounce death, and so we don't use that verbiage at all. Instead, we're using phrases similar to the first responders' phrases as they present information, and it's reported in terms of survivorship. So, for example, I'm afraid I have some very difficult information to share. Authorities at the scene have confirmed that there are fatalities as well as survivors. I'm very sorry to have to tell you that your husband Bob is not among the survivors. That would be one possibility. So let's look at other possibilities. Maybe there are no survivors. Really important to humanize all of this. Yes, you represent the airline, but first and foremost, you are a human being expressing sympathy for another human being. It used to be years ago that the lawyers and the insurance carriers prohibited employees from ever saying, "I'm so sorry." And you're not saying, "Sorry, I've killed your loved one." You're saying, "I'm so sorry for your loss." People want to hear that. It's important that you say it. If there are no survivors, a couple of things need or should follow that. People need to know what happens next. In fact, a very frequent refrain from victim family members is, "I have no idea what I'm supposed to do now." They're completely frozen. They don't know what to do. And in fact, if you put yourself in their shoes, I think that's pretty understandable. So what you want to do is be able to very briefly explain there is a process, and these are kind of the next steps. Remember that Family Assistance Center we talked about early on? Well, that really is the next step, that we're working to establish that. It's always going to be in or near wherever the plane crashed, and that you as the airline are going to pay for and arrange transportation for not only that family member but other family members. What happens at the Family Assistance Center? Well, primarily it becomes the location at which information is being shared. By that I mean both the National Transportation Safety Board, other local, state, and federal officials are doing their very best to not only gather information but to provide it in daily briefings with the families. And that is the main reason people elect to travel there. Again, one of the call center specialists would work with the family in making those arrangements, or if the family elects to stay home, they are provided with a secure conference bridge daily so that they can literally dial in and probably, in today's world, Skype so that they can see what's going on even though they're not there. If it is the accident city, that airport family reception center is meant to be short-term. So we're in the process of getting the Family Assistance Center at the hotel set up to the point where we can now transition you, probably taking or arranging for a bus or some other mode of transportation to transition those family members to the Family Assistance Center. In other words, in both of those scenarios, it's really not wise to let someone drive. They have been told horrible news. They're not, their reactions and their thoughts are not going to be as they normally would be, and I believe their driving abilities are going to be compromised. So really think about that and try to come up with some ways that you can ensure people's safe transport. In talking about doing these notifications, there really is, I'm sorry to say there's no, this is the best way and this is the worst way to break this terrible news. But what we do know is that families have told us what are the elements that made it better instead of worse. And so what you see here are some of those elements. Somebody that says or begins that statement with, "I am so sorry to have to tell you," or "This is such difficult news that I need to tell you." Something to humanize what you're about to say. You can do a lot with your voice. It can sound warm and sympathetic, or it can sound cold and very clipped. And I can tell you, the faster you talk, the more brusque and impersonal you will sound. So slow it down. that will make a huge difference in how you are perceived if you do have to break this bad news. Let's look at some cliches that are common, and I think maybe people have been guilty of using, well-intentioned, but nevertheless not helpful. The other thing we have found is that family members will not necessarily remember exactly what you said, but they will remember how you said it and how it made them feel. And this is not rocket science, folks. All you need to do is ask yourself, how would you want to be treated or your family treated if this affected your family? It's really as simple as that. So let's talk about some best practices with communicating with the families. Very briefly, hearing news of this magnitude, hearing your loved one has not survived an aviation accident, is definitely, it meets the definition of trauma. And trauma is simply an event that exceeds our normal coping abilities. What's more important is to understand how trauma impacts people, both cognitively, emotionally, physically. And so you will be seeing people that are not displaying what they normally would display as behavior. One of the most important ones to remember is that their thinking is not as it normally is. They have difficulty concentrating. You may have to repeat things fairly frequently because people are, physically hearing, but they are not necessarily comprehending. You might hear people say things like, this is not happening. I feel like I'm watching myself in a movie. This is surreal. People may be complaining of physical complaints. And so there's a whole variety of coping mechanisms that come into play, again, because a trauma is something so outside the normal life events that we don't know what to do with it. And all of the things that we're talking about and describing are very normal reactions to this very abnormal event. It's important to remember that. People are not crazy just because they are talking about, watching their body from another place. This is a coping mechanism that is not uncommon and that probably will get them through the first couple of days. And PTSD, if you've ever heard that term, is used a lot of times inappropriately. People that suffer trauma, yes, there will be a small percentage of people who will have continued problems, but the fact is 90% or more are very resilient and they will recover from various kinds of trauma. So when we're looking at communicating, there are just some basic things to kind of remember and some do's and don'ts. We want to help family members feel as much in control as possible because trauma strips people from their control, or at least that's their perception, is they are seemingly without control of what's happening to them and within their lives. How do we help with making that secure and supportive environment? All the things you see there in terms of how we behave, how we offer choices, certainly recognizing and remembering that you want to be seen as the credible source of information and something they can depend on. So remember I talked about the fact that the person that comes in and out of the room every 20 minutes with updates, people are going to start to depend on that. And if all of a sudden he or she has been not available for the last hour and a half, they have lost their credibility with those family members. People are very hypersensitive when they're in crisis, and they come to depend on even these small gestures that can help them feel back in control. Be prepared to repeat information. That has more to do with, again, how they're processing information cognitively. Always appropriate to ask, what can I do for you? How can I help? Important not to do some of the things that you see listed here. One of the most important ones is don't make assumptions about how someone feels, what somebody needs, what this relationship with their passenger loved one consists of. Those are just not appropriate and will, again, destroy any opportunity that you might have to be truly helpful to somebody. So let's take a look at those unhelpful cliches. The worst by far is saying, I know how you feel. That is, first of all, physically impossible, and second of all, really dismisses how that family member is feeling. And so if nothing else, try to remember not to say that, or to say things like, it could have been worse, you shouldn't feel that way, anything having to do with religion or philosophical kinds of statements, don't say that, or statements that have to do with this is what you need to do, pull yourself together, you have young children. None of those are going to be helpful. In fact, they're going to be very hurtful. Instead, these are some of the very appropriate and safe comments is, again, I'm so sorry. That says volumes when you express that little sentence, 4 words, or saying, I can't imagine how difficult this must be, or validating their anger or frustration, and again, asking how you can help. Actually, angry reactions are not particularly common in the first few hours. That's something that may, in fact, emerge as time goes on. But think about the fact that, more often than not, it's this kind of numbness that you will most often see in those first few hours as you interact with family members at the airports. However, if there is a particular family member who is exhibiting some pretty strong anger, you just need to remember what you do every day in a customer service scenario with the difficult passenger. Let them vent, and remember, this is not about you. You just happen to be the closest target. So let's do a summary, what we've talked about today. And first and foremost, hopefully you're going away with the knowledge that if you happen to be working at the departure, the destination, or a connecting station of an affected flight, you must prepare for the arrival of family members. Find out where the copy of your station emergency response plan is kept. You also want to know where your friends and family reception center is located within your airport. Remember to always protect the confidentiality of the passenger manifest. And we talked about really only 3 roles or 3 sets of people that should have a copy presented to them. The manifest coordinator is going to need it, the staff that are associated with the Friends and Family Reception Center, and perhaps the manager on duty. Who does not get provided a copy includes the airport authority, the TSA, and other officials. The National Transportation Safety Board will be provided a copy from and directly from your headquarter command center, but any other request, and especially if you feel pressured or that requester is being very aggressive, please report that to the command center and they will take care of those requests. We talked about the importance of having some person at that station level coming on and off the family assistance bridge. All of the bridge information is contained in your plan, and that really should be somebody that's either an employee, a handler, or an empathia responder. That role would not be appropriate for the Red Cross or somebody from another airline. And again, be wary and be prepared for the media. Especially early on, the whole goal is to be the first to break not only the story of the accident, but actually more importantly is to get that human interest story, the tragedy that has befallen, the Jones family. And they can be very assertive and aggressive in their desire to get that story. So remember, try to arrange for security at the ticket counter. Don't discuss any accident-related information in a public area at any time. And then if you are approached by a member of the media, it's probably always better to say, instead of saying no comment, simply refer that media person to your airline's communication department. They will be the ones to make sure that a consistent message, an appropriate message is conveyed to the media. Finally, let's talk about what happens at the end of your shift. If in fact an accident were to occur, it could be 6, 8, maybe even 10 hours later. This is going to be a very difficult, but I also think very rewarding experience. I hope you never have to go through it, but if you do, please remember you have provided what family members needed the most, and that of course is information. You've represented your company with care and compassion and truly assisted people in their darkest hours. Because this is an assignment like no other, it will be very important to not take people's anger and frustration personally. Now that could be family members as well as your colleagues. Talk to your teammates. They're a great source of mutual support as you're going through this very unusual, stressful situation. And we will be providing an end of shift debriefing. The counselors that Empathia would be deploying to the airport, we have a group specifically to help at the end of the shift, just allow people to talk about what happened, get some information on trauma, because you too have gone through something that's abnormal. You as an airline employee are probably going to have some reactions to the fact that the accident occurred, and so we want to help you with some education around what you can expect, what's normal, and you'll find that in most cases, as I mentioned, all of these are very normal reactions to this very abnormal event. So while we hope the information provided within this training will never have to be put to use in anything other than a drill, being prepared means that any employee or ground handler at any station at any time knows what to do in the event that an aircraft accident occurs. You have taken the first step in enhancing your station's emergency preparedness. Remember, emergencies are chaotic and fluid. You need to be flexible. There is no exact recipe to follow. Remember some basic principles and you will be assured of doing the right thing. And those principles are: people are more important than procedures. In other words, if something needs to be done, if someone needs something, do it. Perception is everything. It's how the families perceive the airline that really matters. Make sure that your actions reflect your airline's intent to provide timely information and compassionate assistance for victims and families. In other words, treat the passenger families the way you would want your family treated. Thank you for completing this training.